scholars
okay.
and staff.
Very nice. Well, I'm Mihaela Popescu. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies. Alright, so let me start again. It's okay, I started early, so no problem. My name is Mihaela Popescu. I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies. And today I'm going to talk to you about vampire. Now, when the Center for International Studies and Programs approached me and asked me to prepare a lecture on vampires, I was of course very honored, but also quite surprised because, you know, my area of expertise is communication law and policy. I'm working on privacy, so privacy, vampires. It wasn't particularly clear how my expertise applies to the topic at hand, of course. And that's, I mean, I really cannot fault the center, because if there's anything, if there's something that everybody knows about vampires, the vampires are Romanian. And because I'm Romanian, therefore, I should know quite a lot about these monsters. Actually, you know, the center is not alone in making this connection. There is a lot of literature, and there are lots of movies that make this particular connection. And in fact, a movie that's currently in theaters, Dracula Untold, attempts to find historical roots for the myth of Dracula, the Transylvanian, the Romanian, right? And traces the origin of Dracula to a young prince, we call it Voivode in Romania, who lived in the 15th century, and was said to be so violent, bloodthirsty, that he was impaling the invaders. And therefore, this violent history is said to have created the myth of Dracula. But the strong belief in the origin, the Romanian origin of Dracula, has spurred quite a lucrative tourist industry. And of course, we Romanians thank very much the Westerners who still believe in that. But there is something very ironic here. And the irony is that Dracula is by no means native to Romanian folklore. I mean, of course, there are lots of cultures that make this association, that, you know, that refer to the undead, and that have all sorts of rituals around the dead who presumably feed on the living. So in that, Romania is in no way special. But to make out of the undead, to turn the undead into the ruler of a country, that's something else altogether, right? So what I can tell you for sure is that the vampire itself, Dracula, is really not part of Romanian folklore, and doesn't become part of the Romanian folklore until very late, until the 19th century actually. In fact, the first reference to the word vampire is present in a letter sent to a Russian prince. And that prince, so it's in Old Russian, and that prince is referred by the term upirliki, which means in Old Russian wicked vampire. There are certain schools of thought as to the origin of the word vampire. Some find the origin of the word in Turkish, the Turkish uber, which means witch. Other schools of thought refer to the Greek verb napie, which means to drink. The majority of the linguists now claim that the origin of the word is in Slavonic languages. We find it in Ukrainian, we find it in Polish, we find it in Russian, in Albanian, in Bulgarian. In any case, it's not Romanian. And in fact, the word vampire doesn't make it into Romanian until 1813. So, if vampires are not precisely Romanian, why do we persist in believing that they are Romanian, right? And more specifically, what function does them being Romanian play in the larger mythology of the vampires? And this is the question that fascinated me, and why I thought that delivering a lecture on vampires would be quite a cool thing to do, right? So why are vampires Romanian if, in fact, vampires are not Romanian, as etymology and folklore show us? So today I would like to do a number of things. So first I want to review with you a very, very brief chronology of the most important literary and fictional vampires, so both in literature and in movies. And second, I want to talk about by reference to the book that started it all, Bram Stoker's Dracula. So let's start with the 18th century. We find actually the first references to vampires in official books in the 18th century, probably as a result of moral panics that had to do with the killing of sheep. So there were lots of worries about creatures of the night who would come and kill the sheep, so in the morning the peasants would find the sheep all bloody, right? And from that, there was an association between those kind of monsters and all the fears about the undead. What is interesting to notice here is that in the 18th century, the vampire was quite low class, if you want. So it was part of folklore. It was the vampire was part of the body of peasants. And not surprisingly, the people who studied all these panics were the clergy, so quite high class. So there were in fact two very scientific books about vampires. One written in Italian, it's called Dissertation About Vampires. It was written by a cardinal. One was written by a French abbé. It was called A Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires, or the Revenants of Hungary and the Moravian region, so on and so forth, right? And then in the 18th century, the 19th century, all of a sudden the vampire becomes high class. So now we are talking about Victorian vampire, the vampire who is part of us, the vampire who can be our friend, and in fact, with the exception of Dracula, all the other books on vampires, which are mostly British and French, talk about vampires in terms of honor, right? They are friendly. They might attack you, but then they are part of your family, so it is your duty to actually feed them. And in fact, some commentators find in this representation of the vampire a sort of commentary on family and all the trouble that family might cause, including homoeroticism, incest, so on and so forth. And then, as we move into the 20th century, the vampire migrates to America. Because of the development of motion pictures, we find quite an enduring representation of vampires in the production of Universal Studios. Universal Studios were actually in competition with Hammer Studios in the UK, so that's Christopher Lee right here. This, of course, is Bela Lugosi. And they kind of churned out all these movies about vampires and exhibit quite a unitary representation of the vampire, sex and violence, of course. So this is the age of the sensual vampire, the vampire who is about nightly fantasies, right? The vampire who entertains relations with young girls. As we move to the mid-20th century, the vampire becomes medicalized. So in the book I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, the vampire, being a vampire is actually a disease. It's a virus. You can get it, you can transmit it, and it's not your fault, right? So it's just like Ebola now. There needs to be containment because vampire is a horrible disease and it's spreading really fast. Of course, I Am Legend in 2007 became a movie with Will Smith, but that's the origin of that movie. In the 70s, now, if any of you here is a fan of vampire literature and movies, you will notice that I am making some horrible jumps, right? So there are some serious gaps here. I'm skipping over important works of literature, but the reason I'm doing that is because I want to pinpoint only those works that actually created subgenres, works that really represent vampires in different ways and the stereotype we've been used to deal with. So in 1972, there is a book that comes out, In Search of Dracula, that for the first time makes this connection between a Romanian prince and the origin of Dracula and Bram Stoker. And the prince is said to be Vlad Tepes. He ruled between 1456 and 1462, who is incidentally the son of another prince called Vlad Dracul. In Romanian, Dracul means evil or the devil, who at some point received the order of the dragon. So there is some ambiguity as to whether these two rulers are vampires or are in fact the devil or maybe dragons, right? But the mythology of the devil and the vampire in Romanian is closely connected. Of course, this idea of a real historical origin of the vampire remained in popular culture. In 2005, there is a remarkable book that reiterates this idea, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. Of course, the movie I mentioned at the beginning also makes that connection. But also, interestingly enough, in the 70s, we have the emergence of the vampire with a human face, so to say. These are books that tell the story of vampires from their point of view. So it's no longer somebody else who reports on vampires. These are the vampires themselves that report on their experience. And they are intensely humanized. These are vampires who don't deserve to be vampires. They are really good human beings who are trying to do as little harm as possible. Some of them don't even drink blood, but they are dipping into blood banks or the blood of animals, right? So this is the vampire that's really a very different kind of monster. It's a monster that has, that doesn't have a bad character. It's really a monster with a human face. Now, in 1975, we also have a very different approach to vampire. So, in one way, one subgenre goes into humanizing the vampire, another subgenre goes into making it an even more monstrous than it used to be. And of course, here we have Stephen King with Salem's Lot, and Rice also with Vampire Lestat is another example of this horror, vampire as a horror story, as a sort of slash narrative, right? In the 90s, we have the emancipation of vampire slayers. Vampire slayers all of a sudden become women. The vampire becomes urbanized, so we have the urban vampire, the vampire that's among us in the city. Some examples of that, original Buffy, of course, Buffy the Vampire Slayer in 1997, but also very, very successful series such as Lauren Hamilton's Anita Blake vampire series with That's Guilty Pleasures, Charlene Harris' Dead Until Dark, which became True Blood on HBO, right? Again, the urban vampire, the vampire who probably hangs out with us in a pub, lives quite a normal life, except that sometimes some things happen and he reverts to being a monster. And of course, in 2000, the iconic vampire, the Twilight Saga. That's of course about the search for identity, particularly adolescent identity. The vampires here, some of them are actually good guys, as we know. They don't even need to stay in the dark anymore, so they have become naturalized, if you want. Okay, so what this chronology tells us is that there is in fact not one Dracula. There are as many Draculas as you can imagine, right? So what do all these representations have in common? Well, really what they have in common is their otherness. So I think it's fair, before we move further, to discuss what is the nature of otherness, how do cultures handle the other. So exactly what turns somebody into the other with a capital letter. And we owe it to Mary Douglas, who is a cultural anthropologist, a British cultural anthropologist, for a very elegant explanation of what makes a culture other in that sense. So she was working back in a time when cultural anthropology still had this distinction between us who are civilized and them, tribal cultures who are barbaric or primitive, right? And she was very bothered by this idea of primitive culture because when she studied this culture, she realized that their rites, their rituals, and their cultural behaviors were as rich as ours. Of course, they didn't have the civic institutions we had, but that was just a matter of time, right? So from a cultural point of view, those societies were actually quite interesting, sometimes even more interesting than our societies. So then what made them primitive, right? And she found the answer in certain habits that we consider to be quite alien. For example, eating raw food as opposed to eating cooked food, right? So in other words, her answer was really what differentiates us from those so-called primitive cultures is how we handle dirt. What we consider to be polluted dirt and how we handle that is really where we draw the line. In other words, what makes dirt is not, dirt doesn't have an inherently objective character. It's really matter out of place. I mean, think about sand. When you trail sand in the house, that's dirt. But when you are on a beach, it's the domestic objects that become dirt, right? Sand is actually not dirt, it's quite clean. Okay, so what this idea suggests is that societies actually have very deep and very enduring systems of classification, and any culture thrives on classifications, and to transgress means really to straddle this border between one category and another, to be neither here nor there, to be somewhere in between. This idea is very nicely illustrated by a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's painted in 1559. It's called The Fight Between Carnival and Land. If you actually look at this painting, you'll notice that it's really quite symmetrical. On the right-hand side, you have the church, right? And the people here are dressed in dark clothes, so they are very drab. They are also very serious, engaged in serious pursuits. They are sober, right? So, as opposed to the people over here we have the tavern. Everybody's engaged in revelry. They are quite drunk. They are also quite fat. I mean, here they are slim probably because they are fasting, right? And down here you have a fight. Okay, in this painting it's a mock fight between the land and carnival. It's a staged fight, but actually this fight is quite serious because this fight occurs on the border between one category and the other, between the sacred and the profane, right? So that actually explains our feelings when we encounter things such as this, right? We have a feeling of anxiety, maybe even disgust. So what do we have here is a woman engaged in bodybuilding. Her body is very masculine, right? So the distinction between the codes for a female body and the codes for a male body are quite blurred. Here you have the lizard man, right? So it's the border between human and animal and a reptile. Again, he is disconcerting because he's neither human nor reptile. He's somewhere in between. Here I put India's Kali Mata rat temple, which turns rats into creatures, sacred creatures to be celebrated. Again, it gives you a sense of disquiet to see a rat hanging out with a kid, right? But this tells you, and there are many other habits in other cultures that are equally strange for Western sensibilities, precisely because they violate both cultural borders that the Western culture has enshrined, right? Okay. So now, the potency of the vampire symbol is, of course, because the vampire is that kind of creature on the border. So first of all, the vampire straddles the most serious border of all, right? The border between the living and between life and death. Vampires are dirty in quite a literal sense. I mean, it's not incidental that vampires are coming out of graves. They trail the earth of the grave in the land of the living, right? Vampires also belong to the human-animal divide. Their humanity doesn't actually hold up on close inspection. There are, of course, the teeth that give them away. Sometimes the color of their teeth, of their eye. Sometimes they can actually turn into animals, or at least they hang out with animals, such as wolves and bats. Vampires are duplicitous by nature. I mean, behind their normal veneer, there is a monster, right? This is, by the way, Carla from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They turn into monster on a moment's notice, so the human face is actually just a mask. They may appear ordinary, but they are quite extraordinary due to their immemorial, if you want, or immortal nature. They kind of bridge the past and the future, and they belong to neither, right? So this is from the movie Interview with a Vampire. But as it happens, they have extraordinary become a vampire right away with all the confusion that entails. Let me just, just for illustration, I picked up almost randomly a sequence from a movie that shows how that happens. So let me show you. The movie is called Innocent Blood, 1992. So, the body of somebody beaten by a vampire is taken to the
That was Mummies. It was him.
Just dance, fella. Come on. 1, 2, 3. Some nights there's so much farting and belching in here, it's like being on the ballpark.
Yeah, well, I'll see you later, right?
I don't show you the rest because it's quite boring. I also skip the sequences in which you see other corpses beaten by vampires, also very smart. Because their transgressive nature is so contagious, we surround them with all sorts of rituals meant to contain this contagion. So here are some rituals. Of course, the wooden stake is a staple of anti-vampire battles. The Holy Cross is said to be another object that contains vampires. The garlic, so here's a Romanian house with garlic hanging from the rafters. Garlic also is supposed to be inimical to vampires. Interestingly enough, in Romania it is said that if you hang garlic around your neck, it's supposed to protect you from cold. Of course, not because garlic has any mystical properties, but because everybody else will stay away from you as a result, the smell being too intense. But there may be some connection there between old beliefs in the potency of garlic and current superstitions about what garlic does for the common cold. Just as vampires need our blood or living essence to survive, they also need our gaze. And this is a very interesting thing about vampires in literature. Vampires don't have a mirror reflection. Quite literally, they need us to make us visible, right? Which tells us something very interesting about vampires. As Nina Auerbach said, vampires are in fact a commentary on ourselves. They are an embodiment of our fears, and each age gets in fact the vampire that age deserves. Now, if that is true, now what role does, coming back to my original question, what role does the Romanianness of vampires still play, right? And to answer that, I want to take you back to Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula is a very interesting book. It's actually quite modern if you read it. It doesn't have a linear narrative. It's actually a story told from many different points of view. So for those of you who haven't read the book, you have Jonathan Harker, who is a young solicitor from England, traveling in Transylvania on the invitation of Count Dracula. You have Mina Murray, who is his fiancée, who is back in England. You also have Lucy Westenra, who is a young girl of 20. She is very nice. She receives several marriage proposals, but she eventually will be beaten by Count Dracula, who goes to England and will become a vampire herself. You have Dr. Stewart. Dr. Stewart is the director of hospice, and he's studying somebody who all of a sudden starts eating insects and killing young animals. It's of course Reinfeldt. He is a dupe of Dracula. He becomes the minion, Dracula minion. So here you have a very psychoanalytic discourse about this otherness. You also have Dr. Van Helsing, who is the specialist on vampires. So this is the scientific discourse, the person who is not supposed to destroy the myth of the vampire, but to actually make it real, because there are all sorts of things that you have to do in order to deal with the vampire. You also have the captain of a ship who is transporting Dracula to England, and he keeps a a diary of what's happening on the ship and how people are disappearing to the point that he has to tie himself up with a crucifix in his hand so that he can keep the ship floating. You also have a newspaper who's reporting on this event. So as you can see, Dracula doesn't actually have a voice here. There are many different voices who are looking at what's happening and telling you the story from many different points of view. So what's the story here? The story is about how Count Dracula wants to come to England, and once in England, what's happening and how eventually Dracula is put to rest, right? But I want to draw your attention to certain interesting things about how Transylvania is described. So here's the passage in Bram Stoker. In the population of Transylvania, there are 4 distinct nationalities: Saxons in the south, and mixed with them the Valakhs, who are the descendants of the Dacians, Magyar in the west, and Szekelis in the east and north, and I'm going among the later, who tend to be descendants from Attila and the Huns, and I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative world. In other words, this Transylvania that Stoker is talking about is not the real Transylvania. As a matter of fact, he never visited Transylvania, right? He is making this stuff up based on his research on travelogues of the era. So Transylvania is not as much unknown or unknowable. It's a place where what can be known is in crisis. It's this kind of place where everything mixes. It's in some way reminiscent of this central area in Rudolph's painting, the place where everything is in battle with everything else, right? It's a mix. To enter Transylvania is to encounter, if you want, a crisis of representation. The fact that Stoker has never visited Transylvania is actually quite clear, where he describes certain areas as with background of rich foliage of oleander and orange trees. Orange trees in Romania, that's quite spectacular. I mean, we have four seasons. It's very cold in Transylvania. To grow an orange tree there really takes a lot of effort. But that's not the point, right? The point here is to make Transylvania a sort of placeholder for a very alien land. It could be Tasmania for all I know, right? So it could be anything. Now, what is Dracula's purpose? Dracula's purpose, so first of all, he tells quite clearly, in our veins flow the blood of many brave races. So again, we have this theme of the mix of many races. Dracula belongs to everybody, if you want. He knows excellent English, but he speaks it with some sort of an accent, just like I do. Has a library full of books on English customs, but he desires to blend in with the English. He wishes to circulate freely in England. And as he says it, he wishes to become a native in England. He says, I want a stranger in a strange land. He is no one. Men know him not. And to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he sees me or pauses in his speaking, right? So this is Dracula's desire, his dream. His dream is to blend in. So Dracula is not dangerous because it feeds on blood. Dracula is dangerous because, So at some point, Jonathan Harker recognizes the true danger that Dracula represents, right? He says, this was the being I was helping to transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come he might among its teeming millions satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle and semi-demons to batten on the helpless. So this is really the danger. The danger is not that Dracula sucks blood and kills the living. The danger is that Dracula is about to colonize England, right? So in some sense, Dracula represents colonization in reverse. Dracula is a character, it's a symbol whose richness and ability to circulate freely, in other words, to traverse national boundaries, signify nothing less than the fact that he's an irreducible other, right? So it's the embodiment of otherness. So thus the other constantly threatens not only ourselves, but our collective identity as well. It sort of blends in, although while being a constant reminder of our fragile sense of self as individuals and as nations. So in this sense, we are all Romanian to each other. And slaying the vampire is perhaps one sure way to conquer ourselves. Thank you very much.
Because Dr. Popescu has to teach at 1 o'clock.
I teach later, so I can stay and enjoy Dr. Ramirez's
Okay,
presentation.
so is there anybody has some like a burning desire to ask some questions about her fantastic kind of chronological, historical trace of the depiction of vampire to the change of different historical time frame and zeitgeist, and also this whole notion of the otherness as manifest in this depiction of vampire in film.
A disclaimer here might be, being married to a lawyer, I have to make this disclaimers. I'm no specialist on vampires. I was trying to look at industries that have vampires in them, right? So movies and how much money they are making, and I was unable to find a number because it turns out there are about 3,000 movies on vampire just in the United States. Goodness knows how many books, right? So I'm thinking that it's a very lucrative.
I noticed, I know you said that you brought out just
things that were iconic for, right?
to go,
Yeah.
because there's so much in
There
between.
is so much in between.
It's unbelievable. I mean, there's this whole series on Nosferatu.
Oh yeah.
I'm just
Yes.
incredible.
And I'm not even mentioning the comic series.
I know, right?
Yes, exactly. So, or the video games, or
Yeah.
there is a huge industry here. But there's something interesting. I want to say one more thing, and then I'm going to let Dr. Ramirez talk. If you look at what's going on in Romania right now, there is a shift from Dracula to Ceausescu, the tyrant who was overturned in 1989. So there is actually literature now that is trying to draw the connection between Ceausescu and Dracula, and vampires. So the vampire, the Romanian vampire, the current Romanian vampire is quite political. It's about totalitarianism. It's no longer about the old aristocracy who's sucking the blood out of the country. So it's a lot more interesting what's happening with the vampire literature. Okay.
Okay, and I also want to mention that Dr. Popescu, she's a professor, associate professor of computation studies, and her expertise is digital literacy, political economy and media, big data. She's going to publish a book by MIT Press on the big data. And so in her self-deprecating humor, she said it was totally good. She happened to be from Romania, but she's quite an expert on the media study, and she has done a lot of research about the digital media related topics, and so also the privacy and surveillance is one of her expertise. She teaches research methods for computer studies, undergraduate, graduate level 2, and she's a fantastic professor. So if you're a student have not taken Dr. Popescu before, you're on track.
Thank you, Elena.
And then next we'll hear from Dr. Luz Elena Ramirez, and she's an expert on Latin American literature and also trans literature. And she also has books on the British representation of Latin America. And so we're so happy to have her today, and she's going to talk about the Egyptian mummy again, and certain things about the portrayal of the mummies as the other and other interesting aspects to it. So I want you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Can you all hear me? I'm just recovering from losing my voice, so it's about time in the corner. I just want to say thanks to Dr. Chang for this wonderful invitation, and to Dr. Popescu for a delightful talk on Dracula and the different ways to read Dracula. And there's a bit of continuity with our papers. Dracula is known, Bram Stoker is known for writing Dracula. He also wrote a fascinating Egyptological romance called The Jewel of Seven Stars. He published it in 1903. So that's going to be one of the texts that I talk about. And Bram Stoker was an Irish writer. He also studied math. So he had this great attention to detail and logic, and he was very much intrigued by excavating all these different facts and all these different portraits of different cultures, not just the Romanian, but also in this case, he's looking at an Egyptian queen and all the artifacts surrounding her excavation. The second writer I'm going to address is George Griffith, who is an English writer. He was a science fiction writer and also a traveler. Unlike Stoker, Griffith did go to Latin America. It was very fashionable for Victorian writers and turn-of-the-century writers to conduct research by going on site. So George Griffith had toured around the Andes, and he had looked into different Inca archaeological sites. So that does inspire his prose. So the title of my paper is The Otherness and the Female Mummy in George Griffith's Romance of Golden Star, and again, Stoker's Jewel of Seven Stars. The peoples of the Egyptian and Incan dynasties devoted great energy and care in preparing the dead, because they believed in the afterlife. Such preparation involved embalming or wrapping the deceased and entombing them with precious items to send them on their journey from this world to the next. These ancient cultures paid tribute to their royalty and their nobility through art, through sculpture, hieroglyphics, and other kinds of records. My talk will address how the fascinating rites of passage to the afterworld and the exquisite artifacts which have been collected from the past inspire the fantasy adventures of George Griffith and Bram Stoker. The removal of an Inca princess from her burial chamber in Griffith's Romance of Golden Star and the extraction of a female pharaoh in Stoker's Jewel of Seven Stars represent two intriguing experiments with mummy acquisition, a metaphysical tango with otherness. In discussing these two texts, I'm curious about the ways in which Griffith and Stoker authenticate their narratives, how they reflect on the act of collecting artifacts from ancient cultures, how they direct our attention to the possession and exhibition of the exotic female body, and how they entertain what would happen if the female mummy were brought to life through a great experiment. Before proceeding to these points, a bit of background on each text will be helpful. In Griffith's Peruvian romance, Golden Star and her brother Vilca Roya are betrothed to one another during Pizarro's bloody conquest of Tawantinsuyu in the 1530s. Griffith's work is often characterized by a synthesis of history and fantasy, and in this novel, he constructs a plot in which brother and sister escape Spanish pillage and plunder by entering into a death sleep. They are reawakened by Dr. Dejana 350 years later, and at this time, Vilca Roya recognizes the impropriety of marrying his sister. This means, of course, that Golden Star is now available to other suitors, notably the English gun-for-hire Captain Francis Harkness. Before she marries Harkness, Golden Star is for most of the novel an object of acquisition, a subject to be studied. Bram Stoker's Jewel of Seven Stars, our second story of mummy acquisition and narrative of otherness, uses the female doppelganger and the idea of reincarnation to contemplate questions both cosmological and ontological. That is, Stoker characterizes the regal, intelligent, mysterious, yet vulnerable Margaret Trelawney as a Victorian double for the voluptuous, dark-haired, and brilliant Egyptian Queen Tara. We learn about Queen Tara first through Van Hoyn's travelogue, and later within a broader narrative about the 1884 extraction of her mummified body in Egypt by English explorers Abel Trelawney and Eugene Corbett. Let us keep in mind that the Trelawney expedition takes place 2 years after Egypt had become a British protectorate in 1882. Thus, Stoker's imperial fiction also works as a form of advertisement in revealing the archaeological treasures of Egypt. How does it do so? It does so through Malcolm Ross, the novel's narrator. Ross reads the Dutch travelogue, collects testimony from Trelawney and Corbett about their research, peruses relevant archaeological studies, and scrutinizes magnificent Egyptian artifacts, including the sarcophagus of Queen Tara. Ross's character not only helps to advertise Egypt for British audiences, but he also allows Stoker to demonstrate his own impressive knowledge about Egyptian mummies and rites of passage. So the first point I again wanted to speak to was the authentication of narrative. Authentication of the excavation narrative in English literature often involves citation of authorities on the subject or travel to a specific geography. Both Griffith and Stoker labor over their descriptions and settings to generate a sense of authenticity, especially as Indiciacal readers had become accustomed to anthropological specificity. Stoker's credibility as a novice Egyptologist surfaces in the setting of Queen Tera's tomb in the Valley of the Sorcerer. This is an obvious parallel to the Valley of the Kings. Equally important, Stoker's synthesis of the real research of Egyptologists Wallace Budge and Flinders Petrie, and Stoker's deep description of hieroglyphics, particularly the Ka, which means the double of man. Also striking is how Stoker's characterization of Queen Tera approximates the life of the historical, let's see, maybe I go back one, or one more forward one. I'm sorry, keep going forward. Keep going. Okay, right here too. Okay. Queen Tera approximates the life of the historical Queen Hatshepsut. Queen Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh who ruled Egypt in 1479 BC to 1458 BC, and Queen Tera rules in roughly 2500 BC. Both of these women are patrons of the arts, and both of them share the unusual practice of cross-dressing. And if you notice in this image, the pharaoh has a beard. This is a female pharaoh, and she did engage in this process of cross-dressing, which is very interesting. Queen Tera, likewise, in Stoker's novel, engages in this practice of cross-dressing. Perhaps most importantly, both women assert their power in a male-dominated society, and the legacy that Queen Tera and her historical counterpart leave is a series of monuments and sarcophagi, despite attempts to obliterate these female pharaohs from history. For his part, George Griffith authenticates Romance of Golden Star by making use of William Prescott's History of the Conquest of Peru, a work that relates Pizarro's conquest and explains the concept of a sister wife among her royalty. And then if you can go back to the painting. There you go. The historically real Inca Atahualpa provides one potential inspiration for Griffith's Vilcarroya, insofar as they are both the last of their royal lineage, and they witnessed the destruction of their magnificent Inca empire at the hands of the Spanish. Additionally, as I suggested earlier, Griffith draws on his own travels in the Andes in the 1890s. He visited archaeological sites of the Inca, and he was very impressed with their architecture and engineering. So having then established a degree of verisimilitude in these fantastic fictions, I'd like to consider how Griffith and Stoker reflect on the archaeological act of collecting. In Romance of Golden Star, Griffith highlights the Victorian penchant for relic hunting in a fresh geography for acquisition. These were the lands that formerly constituted the Inca Empire. The story begins with Professor Lamson, who has returned from a year's relic hunting in Peru and Bolivia, and who is enjoying the luxury of unpacking his treasures with the almost boyish delight which under such circumstances comes only to the true enthusiast. Such treasures would include objects that were buried with the dead. So these are the picture of the llama. Sorry, I think it's not in order. So go to the picture of the llama. There you go. Thank you. So such treasures would include objects like these that were buried with the dead, and these are now on display in the British Museum. Among the items collected in Peru and Bolivia for Professor Lamson is the Inca mummy, Vilcarroya. It's a find that will lead to the eventual extraction of his sister Golden Star from the same royal chamber. Brother and sister will undergo the same process of resurrection. But while Lokoroya tells his own tale, we only learn about Golden Star through his observations, as in this scene. I stood in the doorway and let the light fall full upon the figure. A glance showed me that so far all was well. No profaning hand had disturbed the peace and sanctity of her long slumber. She lay there as perfect as form and feature as she had lain beside me that night in the little chamber of the sanctuary of the sun. They praised her beauty and marveled at the forgotten arts that had preserved so perfect a likeness of life in one for whom more than 3 centuries and a half had neither drawn breath nor known a thrill of feel. So here Lokoroya, as the novel's narrator, takes inventory of the room, and he surveys very carefully her body to ensure that no profaning hand has disturbed her. Because he claims kinship with Golden Star, the Inca enjoys access to her tomb. But eventually he must yield his sister's body to Dr. Dejana, for only the doctor can bring her to life. This brings us to our next point about the possession and exhibition of the exotic female body. Once Golden Star is transported to a remote hacienda in the Peruvian countryside, far from prying eyes, Dejana, the mad scientist of Romance of Golden Star, resurrects her, but his relationship to his patient has changed dramatically. Lokoroya explains that Dejana caught me by the arm and half led, half dragged me to the bedside, and then with his other hand he parted the curtains and pointed to the pillow. I felt his burning eyes fixed on me as I looked and saw the sweet fair face of Golden Star lying in the midst of her dusky tresses, which spread out on the pillow, cleansed from the dust of the grave and soft as shimmering silk. Here, the showcasing of Golden Star's body is a highly sexualized act of the parting of the curtain. By this point, it's clear that Dejana has violated the line between doctor and patient, though it is equally clear that Lokoroya is also entranced by his sister's beauty. At this critical juncture, in steps Ruth Dejana, this is the doctor's sister. She recognizes the male appetite for beauty, and she sees them observing the Inca's unconscious body. Once Golden Star awakens, Ruth takes on the role of nurse, and she sends Lokoroya away, and she warns Dr. Dejana that he may see Golden Star when necessary as her doctor, but only as her doctor. Ruth preserves the Victorian sense of propriety as Golden Star makes the difficult transition from the past to the present, from her protected chamber to a new world. When Golden Star is in this liminal state, she's vulnerable, not only to Dejana's leering gaze, but also she's vulnerable to questions about her own being. She hovers in between object and subject in the great experiment which brings her to life. Up until this point, we have surveyed the authentication of Stouffer and Griffith's works and their shared pattern of collecting artifacts and the exhibition of the female mind. The next remarkable moment in these stories is the English experimentation with the mummy in efforts to bring it to life, and to simultaneously suspend time and see how change is embodied. In both Griffith and Stoker's work, the mummy undergoes this transition, again, from object to subject, from thing to woman. But the ultimate outcomes of this transformation differ significantly. In Romance of Golden Star, Dejana's experiment is successful. Golden Star, Ruth reports, was now once more a living woman, no longer a mummy or a corpse or a subject, as the professor had called her, no longer an inanimate thing that had neither sex nor claim to human rights. So we obeyed her and went away, observes Lokoroya, leaving Ruth there to perform the most sacred task, save one that a loving woman could perform. The resurrection of Golden Star requires, again, these 2 steps. First, her entry into the Victorian world is accompanied by Ruth Dejana, who protects her then later her acculturation to Victorian ways of being and her learning of English. Once Golden Star awakens in the 1890s, her relationship with her brother must remain as one with her brother, not as husband and wife. Instead, Golden Star will marry Captain Francis Hartness as a sort of payment for the Englishman's success directing local lawyers' campaign against the Spanish. Moving back to Jewel of Seven Stars, like Golden Star, Queen Tara has an impressive acquisition. She's one of many items, sarcophagi, scarabs, and Queen Tara's mummified cat, that constitute Trelawney's collection. Ross, again our narrator, observes the great hall, the staircase landings, the study, and even the boudoir were full of antique pieces which would have made a collector's mouth water. Stoker, like Griffith, identifies a strong English appetite for the exotic, and he takes this connection further to transform a domestic space into a museum and later a laboratory. So let's keep moving on. I think there's a sparrow. Keep moving. Yeah. Recognizing that the act of collecting is essentially grave robbing, Trelawney advances the following defense. The Queen did undoubtedly intend isolation, and all told it would be best that her experiment should be made as she arranged it. But just think, that became impossible when once the Dutch explorer had broken into her tomb. That was not my doing. I am innocent of it, though it was the cause of my setting out to rediscover the sepulchre. Mind, I do not say for a moment that I would not have done just the same as Whitman. I went into the tomb from curiosity, and I took away what I did, being fired with the zeal of acquisitiveness which animates the collector. Trelawney goes on to justify his invasion of the tomb and acquisition of the mummy because he sees himself as an instrument of Queen Tara. His claim has some validity, for at the beginning of the novel, readers find him the victim of a mysterious attack which leaves him bleeding and comatose. This we later attribute to the astral body of Queen Tara and her feline familiar. Yet the twists and turns of the story suggest that the Egyptian queen is subject to Trelawney's will, that she again is just merely an object available to his manipulation. In Jewel of Seven Stars, Margaret Trelawney, endeavors to perform the same role as Ruth de Jana. After Queen Tara has been brought to Wales, Margaret attempts to protect her from the penetrating gaze of the four curious Englishmen who are looking at her. These men have assembled to unwrap the Queen's mummified body in a scene much like this one illustrated in 1886. So that's the newspaper picture. It's black and white, so go back. There it is. Margaret is horrified by the proceedings, and Stoker conveys the scene to suggest a double violation. First, of Margaret, who vicariously feels the heated desire of the men in the room, and second, of Queen Tara, who is insensible to the proceedings, but nevertheless the object of them. Ross observes, Mr. Trelawney bent over, and with hands that trembled slightly, raised this linen cloth, which was of the same fineness as her robe. As he stood back and the whole glorious beauty of the Queen was revealed, I felt a rush of shame sweep over me. It was not right that we should be there, gazing with irreverent eyes on such unclad beauty. It was indecent. It was almost sacrilegious. And yet the white wonder of that beautiful form was something to dream of. All the pores of the body seemed to have been preserved in some wonderful way. The flesh was full and round, as in a living person, and the skin was smooth as satin. As with Golden Star, Queen Tara is beautiful and stimulating once resurrected, as she must have been in years past. The scene is at once sacred, sensual, and profane. There is the exhibition and the removal of cloth, which is akin to Dejana's parting with the curtain in Romance of Golden Star. And again, there's the same erotic excitement that fills the air. In Stoker's novel, Queen Tara also enters a jet sleep, as does Golden Star, in order to thwart attempts by rival Egyptian priests to obliterate her name from history. She enters her sarcophagus in a bridal robe with the hopes of awakening in the north. The question the novel raises is to what extent Trelawney is manipulating the artifacts in his own pursuit of desire, and to what extent Queen Tara has orchestrated this grand and complex experiment which would result in her resurrection. By the end of the novel, Stoker has synthesized all the archaeological details which add depth to this fantasy romance. The magic coffer and cedar oil lamps which will release an ancient essence critical to Queen Tara's resurrection. The jewel of 7 stars, which energizes all its mysterious elements. And Stoker's intense description of the hieroglyphics which provide some direction for the timing and positioning of all these elements. Yet despite the scrupulous attention to Egyptian conceptions of life after death, Stoker concludes the 1903 edition of his cryptic novel with equal measure of drama and ambiguity. For at the end of Jewel of 7 Stars, Queen Tara appears for a moment in the material world, but then she seems to die a second death once and for all. If she has perished absolutely, spirit and body, the last scene, I think, the last picture of the cat. Yeah. Okay, so if she's perished absolutely, spirit and body, this scene reveals Stoker's pessimism about Victorian endeavors to revisit the past through archaeology and to revive members of lost civilizations. We may also read in this ending an abandonment of the figure of the new woman, for Queen Tara is not to be trifled with. On the other hand, while her corporeal form indisputably has vanished, perhaps Queen Tara's spirit endures and confounds the male desire to control her. Either way, there is no one, not Margaret nor her father Trelawney, who lives to tell the tale except for the narrator Malcolm Ross. Ross, alone in his protected position, survives the deathly fumes of the great experiment to bring Queen Tara to life. In closing, I conclude that Queen Tara and Princess Golden Star embody the past while fulfilling, to varying degrees, the English male appetite for the other, which is manifest in collecting, in possessing, and in exhibiting. The experiment in resurrecting Golden Star succeeds. She accepts English domestication and fulfills the literary fantasy of English captains marrying exotic princesses. Yet Queen Tara ultimately escapes Trelawney's exhaustive efforts to control her. When the great experiment fails, no knowledge will be shared with Trelawney and his counterparts, and her body has vanished, indefinitely off limits to the Victorian gaze. And the artifacts which were for a moment aglow with the promise of the resurrection are now again mere vessels, stripped of any aura or energy they might have possessed hitherto. It is only absence and negation that confronts the reader of Jewel of 7 Stars. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez, for your wonderful presentation of the possession and exhibition of the quote-unquote others, and also especially in this case with especially women's body. Okay, is there any question? We have a question for Dr. Popescu and Dr. Ramirez. Maybe I have a question I want to ask both of you. Actually, I was fascinated by one of the, because going back to this notion about with some of your discussion about the exhibit, right? Like the British Museum exhibit of, mummy, or I just went this summer. I went to the exhibit on the Dracula, and it's sort of again tracing the historical time frame and the film, and also the Japanese cartoon of the Dracula story. Also, fashion inspired by the Dracula story. So there's a lot of this kind of exhibition of, the quote-unquote the others, and also like representing different historical time frames. But since you two are professors, and when you're looking at this Halloween, right, you look at there's everywhere, you see the mommy little builders and the Dracula or, the pumpkin or this. To what extent do you think that what you're doing, represent our current sort of time and the zeitgeist, and is this sort of just a consumption of one or the other, or is there any other deeper meaning than this notion about the otherness?
Well, for me, it's this is a fantasy of consumption, really, of the consumer society, just like Valentine's Day. I mean, I have an argument here also in Bram Stoker. In Bram Stoker, the day when he meets Dracula is May the 4th. It has nothing to do with Halloween. It has a lot to do with St. George's celebration, St. George who defeated the dragon. Of course, that's also another inaccurate information because Romanians celebrate it on April 23rd, right? So it's, for me, Halloween as a Romanian, I don't have anything in my folklore to relate to it. It is just this interesting way in which, I don't know, consumerism intersects all sorts of beliefs whose legitimacy or historical roots are in question, really. So that's all there is to it for me.
So, Randy or Dr. Chang, are you asking how I might view Halloween as a celebration of, these cultural forms? Is that what you're asking? I just want to make sure I understand.
Or even like, when you're talking about the whole notion of gaze and the exhibit of one for the other, and then I think the Halloween is a prime example of the consumption, more candy and buy more costume, buy this expensive costume, so you look like a witch or, a mummy or vampire and all this. And so I'm just kind of very fascinated by what you two discussion about this whole notion of the otherness and also the procession and the exhibit or misrepresentation of the otherness sometimes.
I would say that since I look at history as an unreliable narrative, that I think fictions can speak truths. So I'm not necessarily attached to a cultural truth. What I'm looking at is cultural patterns that allow me to learn about the Egyptians or to learn about the Inca in rich ways, and to also just discover new texts. So I've been fascinated with the figure of the vampire, with monsters, witches, mummies. And what that's done is it's prompted me to explore texts that I wouldn't ordinarily read. Like, if I had stuck to the canon, I wouldn't be reading Jules Seven Stars, because it's not one of his watermelon works. So I look at this exploration into the other as something that's fun and inspiring. It just allows me to learn about different cultures, and I hope with some level of specificity. I mean, I think that Stoker and Griffith took great pains to, as I say, to authenticate their narratives, and how successful they were is another object of scholarly inquiry. I'm just looking at that pattern. It's like that there's this inquisitiveness about these different cultures, and the way that gets mapped out is through collecting.
There's also something to be said about Halloween as a carnival. It's a domesticated carnival, right? So what's carnival? It's not the reverse, of high and low. So carnival is this time when you are actually allowed to play out fantasies that otherwise would be in quite a different category. So there's a time when you put on the mask of an animal, and that's quite okay, but it's a contained time, right? And similarly, Halloween is something like that. It's a carnival in which you are allowed to enact the dead or the monstrous. It's also quite contained, and it's a way to exercise those fears and keep them at bay for once. So in that sense, it's quite interesting from a cultural perspective, and really patterns about the Dr. Ramirez mentioned.
Any other questions? If not, thank you all for coming. And